And hi everybody, welcome to Fresh Outlook, the show where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm your host Taryn Brill, but just call me TWB. On today's show, we'll begin by asking, what's in a seed? Well, we're about to find out from the Supreme Court. The agricultural legal giant Monsanto is suing a small farmer for copyright infringement, so to speak, of a seed. We'll break it down. We'll also get into the debate over genetically modified foods. From there, we'll change gears and tackle the epidemic of urban violence that seems to be pervading the country. Homicides in cities are soaring. Is gun control to blame? And if not, what is? Finally, we'll get into that cyber security threat by China. A security firm has accused China of hacking into government agencies and more than 115 U.S. companies. We'll get into its significance and the threat of this oh-so-serious cyber attack. But before we get the conversation started, as always, let's meet our all-star panel. Let's begin with Bill. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and I always like to know why you're here.
Besides being invited?
Yeah, that too.
That's right. My name is Bill Rodgers. I'm a professor of public policy at Rutgers University. I'm the chief economist at the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development. Prior to coming to Rutgers, I was at William & Mary in Virginia and had done some stints in the government.
Terrific.
Particularly served as the chief economist for the U.S. Labor Department.
That will suffice. You will remain on the panel after we hear that. And Dee Dee.
I'm happy to be here with you, Taryn, and a political and government commentator, as well as I was an aide to President Bush at the White House and on his campaign, and I'm a blogger.
Right, so we have all different perspectives, but first, on Tuesday, the Supreme Court will rule on a case that could significantly change the field of agriculture as we know it. It could have profound effects on the biotech industry as a whole. Take a look.
That began in America's heartland, and one that goes all the way to the Capitol. This week, the Supreme Court heard arguments in a David and Goliath battle between small-time farmer Vernon Bowman and the giant agro company Monsanto.
I have one good thing going for me. I'm poor as nothing, so they can't take a couple thousand acres away from me in lawsuits. So I was kind of lucky when they brought a suit against me that I was practically broke anyway. So.
Bowman says he did nothing wrong when he planted grain taken from mature crops, plants grown originally from Monsanto brand seed. However, Monsanto says by doing so, the farmer was infringing on their copyright and owes them back royalties. The High Court's decision could affect the future of patent law and how food is grown around the world. Meanwhile, after the failure of Prop 37 in California, several other states are considering their own laws that would require genetically modified foods, also known as GMOs, to be labeled.
With 60 to 70% of our food that we're eating every day having GMOs in it, we have a right to know what's in our food and make those decisions.
So if you think of a box of cereal, you could buy organic cereal, you could buy non-GM cereal, or you could buy cereal with no label. And there'd be three prices.
Opponents say labeling would be too costly, but those fighting for labels insist that consumers have a right to know what they're eating.
All right, we'll get to the GMOs a little later on, but let's tackle this case of Bowman versus Monsanto. Talk about David and Goliath. I'm curious your perspectives on the ownership of a seed. Who should own these seeds, and when does ownership end? Does it end? Monsanto is saying, we basically own the seed and every offspring or progeny of that seed. And the little farmer is saying, no way, I bought the seed, or he didn't buy the seed rather, he just got it from this grain fill, and he didn't, the patent had nothing to do with him. So, Bill, let's start with you.
Sure, this is a tough hole. I typically side with, or at least approach these problems, siding with the little guy. Some of my work I've done with unions and whatnot, but here, I think Mr. Bowman's, he's really got a tough hoe to field the plow here, no pun intended. But
right.
But I think the key here is that I would go to the grain elevator. Why the Monsanto should have gone to the grain elevator, not the small guy.
Right.
Why did the grain elevator sell these?
Why did they have them to begin with?
Exactly.
Right. I fault Monsanto for that. Or I can't say that. Monsanto. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Dee Dee, what do you think?
Well, I'm from Indiana and from fairly close to Farmer Bowman, so it's tough on farmers, and this does seem really unfair because he did go to the grain elevator, which was the point I was thinking too. What about those guys? Those guys seem to be the problem because if they're the ones selling the bad seed seeds.
Right.
Well, then why aren't they in trouble? Why is it on the farmer's shoulders? I don't
Exactly.
understand that. But you can't blame Monsanto because, you know, the law is the law, and that's what it is now. You can't blame them for trying to protect their product. However, it does seem like something needs to change here. It's
Yeah.
not fair to the farmer, and farmers have a tough way to go anyway, so this just seems like a bad deal.
It just seems a little silly to me that there's ownership over offspring of every single seed.
Yeah, how far does it go?
Exactly, where does it end?
But I think the key here, right, is that gene or that mutation, the change that they make in the seed, right? It's perpetual. It doesn't sort of erode or sort of peter out over time.
Right.
That it just continues. It's dominant. I guess a dominant gene for those who.
But it's also sort of monopoly because almost every seed is affected with Monsanto. I mean,
Well,
in Indiana.
Well, but,
Right.
but I think they did say this patent though ends in 2014. So presumably, if it ends in 2014, right, then now you've got removing
So
the
if the
monopoly.
farmer's case goes to 14 and then is he off? Is that
Right.
the deal? Does it expire?
Yeah,
Right.
presumably though. I mean, the farmer, from what I understand, at least what the Monsanto claims is, he had been doing this for about 7 years. He went to the grain elevator, bought some of the mixed seed, as he called it,
Yes.
and then was using those seeds to plant and to replant and
Right.
replant.
But again, I fault Monsanto, or however you said, I fault them because the grains shouldn't have been in that elevator to begin with. You can't blame the farmer
How's
who
he
bought grain.
supposed to know?
Right.
Plus,
He's just right. I mean,
But I see that. But I think that grain that was in the elevator, that was being sold for cattle feed. Which,
Okay.
Which then gets into our GMO conversation. But that's being sold for cattle feed, and to Mr. Bowman's credit, he's being sort of being entrepreneurial, saying how can I cut my costs? Well, let me go
Right.
buy some of this mixed seed, and and I'll start to grow and generate prospects.
Yeah, but everybody does that in Indiana. It's not like he's the only one. So, where are you going to get your seed then?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's a common practice, and it's not fair for him that I think can be
But this is,
on.
but I agree. But this is where I put my sort of PhD economics hat on rather, and that Monsanto and these companies have spent millions and billions of dollars on R&D and research development, and so they need to protect their investment.
sure.
Because I think
then don't put that grain in the elevator that it's up for grabs by anyone.
Well, I bet you one of the probably new technologies, and I don't think the Supreme Court is going to vote against Monsanto, but still, I wouldn't be surprised if there's sort of this conversation. Well, can we create this seed where after one, generation, right?
It like explodes or something like that. Yeah.
It goes back to being, it's not resistance to I guess it's Roundup, which is the sort of store
exactly.
brand
But it's difficult
version
for
of this
farmers
stuff.
to make it anyway, so they have to buy new seed every single time.
Right? How is that?
It's too expensive.
It's too expensive. I mean, really, how can the little farmer afford this? Every time a new season comes, he's got to pay for new seeds. I mean, is that really realistic, especially in the economy we're in?
Yeah, we need to help them out as much as possible. I mean, this isn't fair. I mean, I just don't think it's a good. It's a raw deal.
Well, this is a great piece that I plan on using with my students. I teach an Intro to Policy Planning and Public Health course, and we basically talk about the sort of various criteria around policy creation, and you're raising the issue of equity, fairness, but and also freedom, the liberty of the farmer to be able to to farm how he wants to.
With all the starving people in the world, we're going to put this restraint on a farmer who's just trying to grow food.
Make his own ends meet and provide for the.
But see, the Monsanto response to be is, if you look at their website, right, their sort of mission, right, is about trying to make farming production more efficient so we can feed the 7 to 8 billion to 9 billion
Sounds like more
people
expensive, so
who
they
are going
can
to
make more money because they have to keep rebuying the seed.
Well, one of the implications here, right, is that for the small farmer or medium-sized farmer,
put him out of business. They can't afford it.
I mean, it's just is Bowman just? I'm sorry. Is Monsanto just bullying the small farmer? I mean, is that what this is about? I mean, David and Goliath?
It's just about making money. They just want to keep their products so they make a ton of money. And apparently they do have a ton of money because they've got great attorneys that keep pushing this. And, they keep winning the lawsuits. But that should change. Something needs to change. This isn't fair.
I mean, the Supreme Court sort of has a history of siding with big corporations. Do we really think that Bowman has a chance here? Or how do we feel the ruling's going to go? Bill?
Well, he has a chance.
I mean,
what the problem is.
Hey, look what John Roberts did. You never know.
I think he has a chance, but unless we were missing something, this would be one time I think that the Supreme Court will side with big business or with and because of the potential sort of offshoots and spillover effects that sort of reducing the patent exhaustion, which is the term, shortening that time period.
Right.
Because it'll change the calculus, it'll change the sort of the financial
Sure, and perhaps something
model.
can be done on the state level with the state legislature or something like that. I think everyone should take a look.
I do want to introduce right now, we should have via Skype, Scott Faber. Scott, are you there? Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. You are the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. So I want to welcome you and your perspective. Chime in. We've been talking about this debate of Bowman versus Monsanto. How do you feel? I have a guess how you do feel, but tell everybody.
Sure. Well, first of all, welcome to my kitchen. And
Thank you.
Working for the Environmental Working Group, I worked for the food industries for 5 years. So I can tell you when these GMO seeds were first advertised to us 20 years ago, the promise was we would get higher yields and less herbicides, and what we've actually gotten is the exact opposite. That so far, yields from these genetically engineered seeds have not increased, but we have seen a huge increase in herbicide application, so much so that when you walk outdoors in the Midwest in the springtime, you're actually inhaling some of these herbicides into your lungs, and we're seeing lots more herbicides and pesticides in our rivers and lakes. So far, the promise of GE technology hasn't really delivered. But what's really interesting about this case is that on the one hand, you have the patent office saying, hey, these are novel foods, novel technologies that can be patented. And then on the other hand, you have the Food and Drug Administration saying, you know what, these genetically engineered foods are just like everything we've always eaten, so you don't need to know whether or not they're in your food. We don't need to put information on the label. So it's a really fascinating dynamic that you've got a left-hand, right-hand situation within the government itself.
Right. We were about to get into GMOs, but I'm just curious. I'd like your perspective, though, specifically on this case of Bowman versus Monsanto. Who do you side with specifically?
Well, at the end of the day, the interesting policy issue here is whether or not protecting Monsanto's patent is really going to drive innovation that helps farmers, right? So at the end of the day, probably everyone on the panel wants to help farmers. What we've seen so far is not only has the changes of the last 20 years increased the cost of herbicides, it's also tripled the cost of seed. And that's in part because Monsanto, instead of investing in more research, is spending a ton of money buying up its competitors. So at the end of the result, 20 years after we've introduced GE seeds into the marketplace, we're seeing farmers paying more for seeds, more for herbicides, having fewer choices, and some farmers being unable to find the non-GE conventional seeds that are still strongly in demand.
I mean, at this pace, how can the little farmer keep up? I mean, he's really going to become obsolete. Would you agree, Scott?
But I think your panelists hit it on the head. This is really about a chemical company that has not only made the seed but sells the chemicals that are used to kill the weeds, making more and more money. It's not about what's good for farmers.
Right. So I mean, should we really be worried about sort of these food companies having a monopoly?
It is a monopoly.
They pretty much are. I mean, the guy, they're gasping for air. Guys like Bowman.
Well, it is difficult for the little farmer. I'm telling you, a lot of these folks, they barely make it. The money they don't have money. I mean, what they have is, the earth and the farms and their tractors. I mean, for them to be punished like this isn't right. And actually, it is a monopoly. That needs to be stopped. We're not supposed to have monopolies.
Well, and I just add, the biggest farmers, they'll be fine. They're not only getting, they get the lion's share of the subsidies. They're enjoying record profits. It's the small family farmers who are really going to struggle because of these kinds of decisions.
Let's segue for a little bit and talk about what you touched upon earlier, Scott, this concept of GMO labeling, genetically modified organisms in food. Prop 37 famously failed in California, so labeling will not be taking place. At least in California. A lot of states have measures that are that have started sort of the process. A lot of countries, which we'll get to in a moment, already have this in place. Curious what the panel thinks. Bill, are you for it or against it, GMO labeling?
Scott talked about sort of the left hand, right hand. I mean, this is my profession on one hand. On the other hand, here I have to believe that if we're about trying to provide individuals with good information so they can make good choices, I think that we have to find some common ground about some kind of labeling and improving information. I mean, we're not too far away from the recession, which was caused by a lack of information about.
But the recession's caused by people being broke, and how much money is this going to cost consumers?
No, but let me finish my point. The recession was caused by some problems we had in the housing industry, where people got into housing, got into mortgages that were
technically right.
They got into mortgages that they didn't understand the terms to, or that there was a lack of information. And so you have Elizabeth Warren, who's now U.S. Senator for Massachusetts, who came forward as a leader in terms of trying to improve information that people have access to. So here's a case where I think again providing information via the labeling probably makes a very good sense.
But it is going to cost us, and in the economy that we're in, can the consumer afford it? Scott, what do you think?
Well, that's actually a myth, and
it's what?
We know that's a myth, and I can tell you personally it's a myth because I worked for the food industry for 5 years. I can tell you that food companies are constantly refreshing and redesigning their labels. They refresh them almost every year. So adding 2 words on the back of the package, letting consumers know whether or not a food contains genetically engineered ingredients is going to cost us nothing. And if you don't believe me, you can. There's just a study just came out from Emory University that showed that the change in the cost of changing the label would be trivial and wouldn't show up ultimately in the cost of retail. And even if you go around the world to countries where we have GM labeling, and there are now 65 countries, including progressive regimes like China, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. When you go around the world, you'll see products like this one cost less in places that require GM labeling than they cost in the United States. So there's really nothing to this.
Okay. So Dee Dee, I want to bring you in. Then based on Scott's point, what's the holdup? If the cost is trivial, and you talk about what we're going to gain in terms of our health and just being aware, what is the holdup? Why did it fail in California?
I think it should be by law. I think everything should be labeled, because you know what? I mean, Americans die of cancer a lot more than other countries. I think a lot of it are like, well, we have 16 ingredients, 25 ingredients in food. When you look at the packaging, it's very unhealthy. How would we know that otherwise? And if we're going to have hormones pumped into meat, I mean, we should know this. So yeah, I think that it's very, very important that our food is labeled.
Okay, so I mean, Bill, why do you think the Prop 37 failed in California?
Well, I guess
seems like a lot of people support this labeling.
Yeah, but I believe it was very, very close.
It was close,
right? They were even so close it triggered a recount. And from what I understand, one of the major reasons was that agribusiness and the biotech industry, and they harnessed a bunch of economists to, side with
lobbyists,
with the lobbyists,
the lobbyists
and basically, sort of made some raised concerns about, I think, the particular language with regards to putting requirements that you say natural or all nutrient, or not all nutrient, doesn't make sense, but all natural, no preservatives, and that, I guess, they created a lot of sort of misinformation or misunderstanding around that, and so a lot of people ended up getting confused.
Right. I mean, I feel, shouldn't the consumer have a right to know?
Absolutely.
At this point? We should 100%.
It should be a no-brainer for everyone.
It should be a no-brainer.
Yeah. Especially, I didn't know in terms of what Scott talked about in terms of the estimated sort of increased cost to labeling. That to me now puts it on the edge.
Yeah, but too bad if you're not alive and you're eating hormones and things that
are
bad for you.
I'm supporting him. I'm agreeing with him that that the marginal cost of doing the labeling now with these added names of whether yours is natural or it has GMO or GE. If that's basically zero.
Right. And Scott had pointed out there's so many countries that already require GMO food labeling: China, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, India, and Chile. Just a few.
Yeah, I feel like 50 or 60.
Yeah, it was a lot. It's somehow we have a yellow light going on. Last thoughts, final thoughts, Scott. We got to wrap.
Well, what's really interesting about this issue is when pollsters ask Americans, they overwhelmingly say, 93% say they want labeling, and that cuts across all demographics: men, women, black, white, even Democrats and Republicans. Republicans overwhelmingly want labeling, and that's because consumers want to know more about what's in their food, not less about their food. They want to know what's in it. They want to know how it's made. Right. They want to know where it's from.
Right. So hopefully we can make some progress sooner rather than later. Thank you, Scott, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up on Fresh Outlook, homicides are on the rise in some major cities across the U.S. Who or what is to blame? What do you think? That's next. Stay with us.